Hey, thank you, Beth Ann. And it was great to be with you guys at your last Global Summit a couple of weeks ago, which got great reviews from everybody I was talking to. And of course, I was on that a little bit as well.
So let's get right into it. Your title is Customer Marketing, and that has taken on many different definitions through the evolution of commerce. As we think about the future of commerce, I would love for you just to start there. What does customer marketing mean to you, your role, and to the Coca-Cola company today?
Sure. Well, in many ways, it hasn't changed so much because we're still trying to create value as the customer or the partner would define value. However, the context has clearly changed, and that's a big part of our work. We do have a future of commerce capability, if you will, that we share with customers and partners as we think about growth in the short term and the long term. And at Coca-Cola, we're just very fortunate to have so many different partners like yourself and so many others to really have some pretty proprietary research and perspectives on the topic. So just real quickly, Beth Ann, if I had to say, quick context here would be just the move to ecosystems. The top 5 global customer retailers by 2025 will control about 30% of all commerce and 50% of growth. And those are folks like Walmart, Amazon, Alibaba, JDD, Pinduoduo, et cetera. So kind of a big deal. And so how we operate with customers is a little different in that context. Secondly, last mile providers are very understated in many cases. They're incredibly important. So how we partner with customers, that's a big part of the narrative. Someone like Rappi or, Instacart here in North America, they're the first and last moment of truth in so many ways. And so we, as a brand and working with a customer, we have to find the right synergies to drive value from that perspective. And then just lastly, the acceleration of online to offline continues to ramp up in new and innovative ways. There's many different types of commerce innovations that are happening, many of those coming in from China. And underneath all of that is really enterprise technology and AI and automation. Probably the biggest factor that we're sort of prepping for, if you will, is AI and automation. There's probably nothing bigger in commerce in terms of what's changing the landscape going forward.
Could not agree more. And we're going to get into that change, just really dive into the conversation around the different forces at play right now. We both have been through this acceleration. It's interesting when people talk about an acceleration happening because of COVID, because really what's changed is nothing that we weren't already predicting. It's just that it's all happened in a very consolidated, faster pace than anyone was ever expecting. And we know, like, consumers are usually the ones that are driving new trends. They're the ones that are forcing marketers to pay attention in new ways and for us to meet them where they are. And it was really that critical mass moving on through technology with a complete behavior shift of becoming much more of a digital shopper, right? I mean, even in categories like your own, where I think sometimes people would have predicted certain segments of the population would maybe never have moved online. So we've also been looking at different ways of trying to make sense of new frameworks, new ways of thinking about this evolution, these trends, and the pace of trends and the speed of which things are occurring. And so I would love to hear from you about some of those influences. What are some of the things that you look at to shape the frameworks that you apply for Coke? And I know one of the ones that you and I both looked at is sort of the generation of commerce and context. And I think we're at generation 4 right now. When we think about like what shaped, first and second, it was really around convenience and value being offered through this idea of like one-stop shop. And then 3 brought on this focus leveraging data on newer, lower pricing strategies and newer ways of thinking about transparency of pricing and how we offer value to consumers. And now we're moving into sort of this wave of the 4th generation. How are you applying this kind of thinking in this framework to shape the work that you do at the Coca-Cola Company?
Sure. Well, Generation 4 commerce, which is sort of the context we're in now, much like the previous generations, in many ways didn't really create new demand. Walmart didn't necessarily create new demand. They just substituted demand. The same with Amazon. So this substitution factor is something we're going to continue to see more of going ahead. And as you go from one generation to the next, there's a new S curve. And as you go from one S curve to the next, S curve, you have to do a few things. So very, very big picture strategically, I have to reallocate, human capital and working capital. And that's kind of a difficult thing to do. In many cases, if you're a restaurant or a retailer, is how do I quickly, reallocate my people and capital to this new S curve? So that's one of the challenges and something we work with customers on. Additionally, you really want to upskill your associates. Clearly a pretty important matter. And so we help a bit with that. Probably in the history of commerce, I think many people would agree, it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur, full stop. It's so much easier to get to the consumer. However, if you're a large enterprise, more than ever, you have to be an entrepreneur. If you're working at a big Fortune 500 company, you must be acting like an entrepreneur. In many cases, in many of the most categories, these micro brands, these explorer and challenger brands are taking disproportionate share. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is they're entrepreneurs and they're moving at unprecedented speeds and they're so digitally native. So this is a lot of the context, for Generation 4. I think one competitive business model to think about, kind of stepping back and looking at Generation 4 and kind of coming in, maybe it's too early to tell, but I've been a Generation 5, is really 4 areas. If I'm running an enterprise, one, I'm definitely, moving to more data-rich platforms, collecting more data. It's more important than ever. I think we all know that. Restaurants and stores simply become, data hubs with sensors everywhere. Secondly, I'm going to overlay on that, basically AI and automation, machine learning, deep learning, RPA in simplest form. Because when I have the data, then I can do something with it when I have the algorithms, et cetera. However, this is where the breakdown usually happens with research we have, is if you don't really have enterprise agility, if I'm really not built to go fast and really take advantage of the insights today, create new demand today, have a demand center today, it's going to be a problem. So really being agile, moving quickly, real time is paramount. And then part of that also is acculturation, because you can have some of your members of your leadership team, the frontline workers that are concerned about, AI, automation, it's replacing my work, but really you want to make that not a black box, you want to make that a glass box. And you're very transparent with the organization around how cobot, about that, is going to be a part of your work going forward. You're going to work with bots and machines and algorithms to do your role. And more effectively, you're going to get more accomplished. And so this sort of competitive framework clearly is what the winners are sort of moving to. It's difficult because you do have to move capital and people to a new way of working, especially in the context of brands, challenger brands, which are pretty important. The last thing I would say just on AI and automation, more and more, there's no question about it, more decisions in commerce get made out of sight. That's a really big point. And in many, many cases, you're going to still sell to a merchant. I'm still going to go to the consumer. That's really important. I'm going to fly into Bentonville, Arkansas and work with Walmart. It's still going to happen. However, I'm also going to work with algorithms, and I'm going to learn how to understand algorithms. I'm going to learn how to influence algorithms, because it's required in my customer work with my restaurant chain, with my retailer, with my aggregator, but also to the consumer. Because if I don't understand the algorithm, almost like a search protocol, I'll never get to the consumer. So these new ways of working are here and now, and they only accelerate going forward.
It's very interesting, especially when you start thinking about this need to do it today, need to operate in real time. How does that happen when you're working also with partners? How does that happen when you're collaborating across data, your own data, maybe things that your partners are bringing into the data system to augment it further, and then the data that you're getting from your customer or your retailer partners? It feels like it's getting complex, but in some ways, perhaps if some of this is being automated, over time, it will be able to simplify. As to your point, we get into more agile ways of working. One thing that we found working with clients is that we would talk agility, but it was a concept, it was in the abstract. And one thing that happened over the last several months is people were forced into this thing called agility. And now they're taking a step back going, okay, wait a minute, actually what we're doing and how we're behaving internally, this is agile. So now it's a process of codifying and capturing what's changing, and then how can you do things to make sure that you're perpetuating it. So let's talk a little bit about that. The structures that need to change, the roles that need to change, and those strategies that are driving and making sure that you're able to perpetuate that change. I know that two of us both watch closely China. We both work closely in that area of the world too. And if you think about what Alibaba has done with new retail and just everything that they've done, constantly evolving their platform to reflect these kinds of changes. And if you can consider that they're out ahead, whether that be 3 months, 6 months, or a year, even as things accelerate in other parts of the world. Talk to me a little bit about that. How are you being inspired by some of that activity? And what are you doing internally to rethink some of your structures and your ability to adapt to these changes?
Well, a lot there. Good question. I would just say for me personally, you definitely want to study, let's just call it China commerce. And certainly there's 3 platforms there, JDD, and what they're doing with Walmart and the way they're working with Walmart there as a federation is a pretty important point. Obviously, all things Alibaba, new retail, the Fresh Hippo store, and then PDD, Pinduoduo, is truly reinventing social commerce. If you want to kind of see what the future of social commerce is, it's not on Facebook. It's clearly what's happening with PDD in China, the way they're forming these buying groups with consumers. And we're just seeing new commerce models that have never been seen before. They're pretty effective, especially reaching sort of hinterland consumers in many cases, lower scale income consumers, which can often be left out. I think you still want to, be a student of traditional legacy brands that are definitely making the transition. Walmart is a wonderful case study, and William White, again, what they were doing is phenomenal. Obviously, Nike. I think Challenger and Explorer brands need to be, way up on the list of learning. And for me, I like Quip, Halo Top, Dirty Lemon, etc. Beyond that, I listen to a lot of earnings calls. I try to listen to 5 earnings calls a week of the big major platforms because they're so far ahead. And the terms they're using are just different, than sort of some of these other companies. And then most, folks I know are sort of starting to form learning circles. They're forming those formally, maybe with some customers and partners, or they're forming those internally, or, maybe an ecosystem of internal, external, et cetera. But I have a learning circle around AI and automation. I have a learning circle around brand management. And by being a real active learner and really leaning in, I think that's kind of how you really have to be positioned. Mm-hmm. And then frankly, just my own point of view, having started a startup, as a few years ago, if I was hiring today for a pretty senior marketing position, this is just my personal opinion, I would want someone who's led an entrepreneur brand or worked on an entrepreneur brand, because so many of my friends that are working at Fortune 400, 300 companies, it's required training to learn how to be an entrepreneur. Literally, like you're going online to learn how to be agile, to learn what an entrepreneur really is. So if you've never really done it, it can be a little harder. And so I think lastly, especially just for someone like myself who's a bit older, you have to unlearn. And that's something you're not going to hear probably a lot. What do I have to unlearn? Because many of the principles that I went to MBA school are outdated. They're based on generation 2 and generation 3 nomenclature and a different time. And so unlearning and relearning, I think, are critical as a part of that. These learning circles are powerful. They're done right.
Yeah, to that point, we also both are avid readers, and one of the books that we've talked a lot about that we both have read recently was Quantum Marketing by Raja Rajamanners, CMO of MasterCard. Couldn't probably be in a better position to see everything that is changing in commerce, from consumer buying patterns, why they buy. They sit on top of so much interesting data, and then they partner, of course, with so many interesting platforms. So they're sort of they've been at the heart of this change. And he uses his experience to bring about this thinking in this book. that really does take you on this journey of kind of the fundamentals, as you say. How do we have to rethink some of those fundamentals? Why are some of them obviously still important to how we think about the future, but what is changing and how to think about all that change? I think I mentioned to you, I was laughing when you got to one of the final chapters on talking about the future CMO and the role that they have to play. And, I think it was like maybe 12 different aspects and attributes that CMO had to have to make the ideal person. It's probably a unicorn or, that needle in the haystack that you're looking for, but building, to your point, the team and the network that brings about that diversity of thinking and experience, and being able to take a beginner's mindset as you approach that. I would love to hear a bit more on your side, one, maybe some takeaways from that book, especially because it was broadly speaking about marketing, although it gets to the connectivity of marketing and sales and e-com. But how would you apply some of that, or how have you been applying it to your thinking around commerce? And with that, what are some other brands and companies that you admire?
A lot there. Let me just think, first, just in terms of, sort of mentors, if you will, or people that I'm following that I know that provide tremendous insight would be, for example, Jay Walker, who's with your larger group, Dan O'Connor. If you're not following him, I'd highly encourage it, over with the Harvard Business School. Scott Galloway, I think we talked about that. Raja. Some of these are, we all kind of follow. I think the Insight group is really good in terms of some of the models that they're pitching. Clayton Christensen was the original founder there. I really like Kathy Wood in terms of investing. She's really outlined like 5 future tense, really platforms that will generate much of commerce going forward. Excuse me. And then, I think what Raja talks to is a bit around what they're also talking to in business schools today, and that is this idea of a dual transformation, Beth. And so if you're a company today, obviously you want to be around in 2025, clearly. You really have to do 2 things, and Raja speaks to this a bit. I have to plan present forward. I've got to pay dividends and cash flow, and those are good things. And I have to sort of position the enterprise for the future. And so I have to have pilots and experimentation, and probably need to spend 20% of my time and capital on, initiatives that give me learning to think about how I want to, plan long term. And so I think most organizations are taking chapters from what Raja's doing now from Insight. And ultimately, the best case study here is Netflix. Netflix was, the form factor was pick, pack, and ship. I'm going to ship you these DVDs, and all along comes streaming. Much like what we talked about earlier, I'm being substituted, which is kind of what's happening Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3. I'm being substituted. So what do I do? It's an and proposition. I keep running the business as is because I need to generate revenue, profit, and I make the pivot to streaming. And as you do that, you have to build new skills, obviously. And so a lot of what Raja's outlining there, I think, is dead on. A couple of other things I would just point to: the brands I think that are really positioned to win most going forward, really are taking brand purpose seriously. I mean, it's more than just like a PowerPoint slide. They're really living the brand purpose. The research I see from Generation Z and what they're going to care about the next 20 years, that's way at the top, much more than millennials, et cetera. And frankly, they're going to be scorecarding us. Kind of a key point around ESG, environment, sociability. You're likely to see going forward, signals. It could be a shelf tag, it could be a digital tag on how this brand or SKU is good or bad for the world, for the planet. I think that really picks up significantly going forward. You can look to clues from Western Europe where we're starting to see some of this, but those are just some random thoughts as it relates to that.
To that last point, it's interesting because purpose was something that we used to think about in the realm of brand, brand awareness and more upper funnel ways that we would think about building brands. And it's really become so much more important from a commercial lens. Like your point, there's, a wallet share that we're fighting for, and the consumer is really voting with their wallets. They're deciding, like, I'm not going to get behind this brand, not just in terms of preferences or what I might tweet about or influence my community around, but actually what I actually buy and what I feel good about having even in my refrigerator. Are there things that you're doing at the, the Coca-Cola company in that regard to understand that consumer value proposition, meet them with newer types of packaging formats or things that feel like they're more genuine to that context?
Yes, I think Coca-Cola, like a lot of big FMCGs, is pivoting to digital, pivoting to the growth sectors, if you will, and really doubling down on data and insight, so you really understand that consumer, that user journey end to end in a far better way. More assets into basically data capture, really important. And then, ultimately thinking about brands a bit differently. I think all the big FMCGs are, it used to be, I perhaps if I was at P&G, there was a brand template for how you build a brand, like Tide, let's say. And maybe you took that same template over to a very smaller brand and you thought that template would work. I think that is, that's not what's happening today. Most of these big FMCGs, they're looking at brands at least in three ways: challenger, explorers, and leaders. And how you grow them, the algorithm is completely different. And you're codifying how to grow those three types of brands. And there's some real patience, if you will, around some of these smaller brands at some of these bigger FMCGs. And if you're a retailer, what's interesting just around these micro brands, in many cases, they're preferred just because they're different and they have such a big digital audience, and they can provide differentiation to your digital or retail shelf. So it's a fascinating, complex, ever fast change, probably the fastest change ever in the history of commerce happening now. And I think more and more, commerce and marketing are just blending. I mean, I don't think of them so different anymore. It used to be sales was over here, marketing's back over here. Today, they're absolutely never been more connected. And so I think that's actually, a really good thing.
Oh, I agree. It's, some people used to think of it as a little bit of a collision. And I think now, to your point, it's like the lines are blurring, and the ways that we think about what used to be sort of distinct activity is definitely blending. Which is, awesome to see. And I think is part of what's creating the creative potential in the space as well. I was just judging the D and AD awards for the commerce category, and it was incredible to see the submissions. And again, a lot of that was COVID forcing creatives into thinking about the pain points along the consumer journey differently and solving with very interesting commerce activity. So I think it really is changing in the marketing mix and across media, especially as retailers become media spaces, the way we think about commerce. Your business is also tightly linked to the restaurant business, especially when you think about kind of out of home demand for your brands, and ways that people start to sometimes even learn about newer brands that you may have, or like what you've done with Freestyle is a great example of putting the consumer a bit more in control and allowing them to sort of drive taste combinations. I'd love to talk a little bit about that business. I know for our commerce conference, we had Kurt Kane from Wendy's, and I know you related to that conversation he had with John Cook. But this has also been a massive disruption in terms of thinking about out-of-home dining and the fast casuals. Tell me a little bit about how you're evolving your partnerships and the ways you're looking at those relationships in that business.
Sure. That's really where I'm spending most of my time now, is with our larger restaurant and QSR chains. And we definitely see a new restaurant economic model that's sort of, evolving post COVID-19, because as we all know, COVID-19 just sped up exponentially all these emerging trends. So restaurants obviously leaned in a very big way and improved their digital maturation, in a matter of months, which might have taken years. So, there's sort of 6 parts to that story very quickly. We definitely think that the on-premise operation changes significantly going forward. Now, in many, many cases, a restaurant or QSR could be considered just a distribution node. In other words, maybe 70% of my business used to be, in the restaurant, 60%. Today, it may be 80% is not restaurant. And maybe that's the way it stays, or certainly trends that way. So these parking lots are becoming really mobile transaction centers, and there's a lot underneath that. And if you come into the restaurant, maybe it's going to be for the experience, but I'm going to have a draw for you, something like maybe a community hub. And Chick-fil-A and some other brands are doing some interesting work here, so the community can come here at a designated place, etc. So I'm going to radically change the format also because of hygiene and sanitation. Big new lens there. So, and we're seeing most of the big QSR chains develop and sort of remodel the physical structure to what we're talking about. Secondly, many of the more restaurants are going to go direct to consumer. I don't mean they're going to ship them, something, but they're going to find ways to directly connect with you to drive more affinity, loyalty, data capture, on and on and on, just like the big FMCG brands are. We're already seeing this. There's plenty of use cases. The third is really the use of dark kitchens, which could be a $1 trillion business by 2030, the growth of delivery. We also think as a part of that, automation picks up significantly with vending. So I'm going to have this very high-end, high-tech, high-quality food-producing machine, and I'm going to place that where humans go. I'm not necessarily going to have a human there, but I'm going to have this sophisticated capital, and we definitely see much more of automated commerce happening in that manner. And then just the last three elements would be a more conscious effort against consumers that are challenged economically. And so that might be with subscription models, that might be with loyalty models that reward that type of behavior. But there's definitely some consumers that are in a different place economically coming out of COVID, and I'm going to reach them in different ways. Also, fifthly, would just be technology. We see lots of AI coming to the restaurant business. And so you think about what McDonald's has done with dynamic yield, Yum has done some really interesting work with AI and automation, RBI going down the same path. And you're going to see personalized selling really take off even more with all of this, and really more automation in the back of the house because the quality could be better. And as labor rates continue to grow across the world, especially in markets, as a franchisee, you kind of like the economics of robotics in the back of the house in many cases, once you get past the capital pain, if you will. And then lastly is just a move to get my brand to the home. Look, the fastest growing channel in the world is the home. How do I get better connected to the home? And so if I'm going through the drive-thru, if I'm pulling up in the parking lot, I'm getting lunch, how can I also sell you a prepared meal, much like you would get at a grocery store? And so that's sort of this context. I would say also retailers have never pivoted faster and more aggressively for the meals business because of COVID-19. And so the battle for meals between restaurants and retailers has never been, I think, more competitive or more cooperative, because in many cases, they're partnering together to grow their brand and sales. And we're seeing phenomenal collaboration use cases with restaurants and retailers. So never dull currently.
I've really been fascinated to see some of what different restaurants have done. I love those meal kits, where you can just pull up and they give you a recipe in a box of the ingredients, and they have all this extra supply in some cases. So I thought that was incredibly creative. I do think, to your point, like there was, again, who would have thought that you would order a McDonald's to be delivered to your home, or some of the other fast restaurants, you would just not think about having that ever delivered. It was, again, one of those things that you need that inflection point or that, massive shift to take place to give you the use case of when you say, I'm on Zoom calls or I'm working, flat out straight, and I don't have time to get to a drive-through, and that's what you want. So the, added, additional convenience of having a Starbucks delivered to your front door makes a lot of sense. So tell me a little bit, that was a lot of the what, which was amazing to learn about, but I'd love to get into, if you wouldn't mind, a bit of the how. So how has your relationship evolved? How are you joining the restaurants that you work with in this type of a conversation? How are you kind of co-investing in innovation? And are they shaping and helping you think about your business? Are you sharing data on the consumer and this new connected consumer? Tell us a little bit more about how this is working.
Sure, Beth, and I think you hit on a lot of it. So we're trying to be a good partner, and as COVID was obviously taking place, we were leaning in on delivery, working very closely with small chains as well as the larger chains on how do we help you pivot the menu to delivery and digital. And so, that could be the form factor. So maybe it's less of fountain drinks, it's more of a packaged drink, obviously. Maybe it was also a real increase in the quality of, call it, the digital menu. And so, my hero imagery is built out for mobile, so I can really understand what the beverage choices are on mobile. I can have more dynamic, high quality content in general on the menu, because more and more the menus really are coming on your phone. So how can I make that experience better? And certainly, I think helping drive beverage incidents and sales with our food service aggregator partners all over the world. So it's really, like always, sort of the and story, working with the customers, obviously big and small, trying to create value for all of them in this new digital context, especially with what we talked about with restaurants and with the key last mile providers. All of the delivery aggregators across the world, which have seen obviously unprecedented demand for their business. And so those are just a few ways. And certainly coming out of COVID, we're excited that consumers, I think, are ready to go back into restaurants a bit more. But certainly many of the rituals that have been developed, that's a key term, the rituals that have been developed over the last year and a half, if you will, certainly last year, well, there'll be stickiness there. We definitely think that when we look at all the research, there's going to be a high stickiness factor to mobile orders, to delivery, to this parking lot, and not going maybe in the restaurant, but click and collect. And certainly, you look at the retail side, we've made the same pivot, towards e-commerce, towards the digital shelf, and figuring out ways to help retailers drive click and collect. From a retail perspective, you could see the China model kind of playing out all across the world, whereby in many stores, maybe 30% of the revenue is driven by click and collect and e-commerce. And the store, once again, like the restaurant, becomes a distribution node, first and foremost. So when I remodel the store, I'm going to be thinking about it like that. And to have consumers and people and humans sort of go into the store or restaurant, I'm definitely going to be looking to drive the experience factor. I mean, you and I, when we were in our 20s, we probably went, to Macy's or somewhere, or Sears on an escalator. That's not happening anymore, right? So it's a little different, I think. And so truly understanding the Gen Z consumer is going to be important. And then also, kind of maybe moving away from consumer insights to human insight. I think Coca-Cola and all the FMCG brands, restaurants, retailers are definitely doing that. I want to understand the human behavior in aggregate, wide lens, so I truly understand the context better and the journey and where I fit best, versus I'm just going to look at this consumer. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. And, I know we also are both fans of Scott Galloway. I think he may have made a quote similar to that, where he said, there's no shopping in the future that requires an escalator, However, I have to say, especially given that one of our offices at 3 Columbus Circle in New York is right across from the new Nordstrom, it takes a really great development and architecting and designing for the new consumer. And you can see people are already coming back in there, especially a younger generation who craves physical experiences. They crave, like you said before, community and a place that sort of is a magnet for drawing them in. That gives them a reason for being there, where there's demos and bands and boutiques and food and all those things that make it worthwhile to come out in the physical world. Will it happen the way we used to shop, or will it happen around seasonalities the way it used to be? Definitely not. But on that same thematic, I would love to hear you talk slightly about one, there's a connected consumer. So we know that they've got a mobile device in their hands, and it's not just physical or digital. To your point, it's online to offline and back again. But how are you all thinking about experiential and still an element of activation that has a physical component to it?
Well, I still think that's really important, but it's probably a lot different, right? How we think about experiential marketing. I think more of the experience happens on digital, quite frankly. I mean, in the past, I think if you said experiential marketing Beth Ann, maybe I'm wrong, but I think many people would say, well, that's a physical execution. We're going to have the agency. We're going to, well, still going to do some of that, but it's going to be there's going to be a wider lens on it, because really for many to most brands, the first touch point ever is mobile. It's not something physical, it's mobile. So the experience needs to be obviously pretty amazing there, and then end to end. So I think there's definitely a focus on that from everyone that I'm talking to, and certainly the use cases. And to bring that together, I think you have sort of two factions of marketing. You have the traditional brand marketers that have a lens on experiential, right? These were folks that went to MBA schools maybe 10 years ago, and that's really important. However, and I'm going to have maybe others that understand performance marketing and maybe grew up in marketing from a digital perspective only, and certainly have a different lens. You really want to have both of those groups working together to drive the overall experiential and, frankly, brand strategy. And I think that's what a lot of companies struggle with, because the culture can be different. These, personas are a little bit different, if you will. You really want both working together.
Yeah, we do a lot with blended teams, to your point, so that you can bring together people who really have exposures and experiences building both types of experiences, and then bringing them together to think about it in new ways. We had a massive pivot last year where we created this notion of live digital experiences, and another notion that goes along with it around no dead ends. So there was, literally any way you came into the experience, you were allowed to be able to move through it, to buy product, to learn more, to become part of a customer relationship management set, and really part of a community. So it really made us think through, again, in a very both practical but ambitious way, what the future of experiential was going to look like. So we have a bunch of questions coming up, and I want to just offer to the audience, if you have any other questions for Barry, please put them in the Q&A. Are you okay with me putting you in the spot with a few of these questions that are going to be new for you from the audience? Great. Okay. So the first one is, can you define e-commerce and digital commerce for your company? How are you all defining that?
Well, there's lots of ways to define e-commerce. I think we're looking at it like many others. There's, direct to consumer. And so I think we're going to see more activity a bit there across FMC in general. There's business to business, and we're going to see more of that. And so electronically, there's a lot of benefits going to business. And then a myriad of ways to go business to consumer. So think, Walmart.com, et cetera. Those are just sort of three vectors. There's others that are evolving that we've talked about today. I think one that I think is going to come to Europe and certainly the Americas fast is live streaming. So we're going to see more commerce happening live streaming. We're going to see the store and the restaurant used as a content engine. And if you're an entrepreneur, you're already doing this. This is what's so interesting. So if you're an entrepreneur, you already know how to do this. If you're at a bigger enterprise, you're probably learning how to do this, and there's going to be a lot of value in it. But I think e-commerce continues to evolve and expand in its form factor exponentially going forward. And a lot of the clues, as we've said before, are in China.
I like what you're saying about live streaming, because if you think about it, and we both come from obviously a customer sales trade background, where you think about a traditional sales force. Now basically it's beyond influencers. It becomes every single person. It's an infinite potential of a sales force, which is amazing. When you have people who are streaming the ability, and you can create a buy now right in that moment, it just creates so many opportunities and potential in the future. What do you see as the biggest challenge that you're facing for the future? Is there something that is really kind of an obstacle or a challenge to the progress?
I think for any enterprise, especially a legacy enterprise, the challenge is twofold. It's moving your capital and then pivoting your people, because so much of your capital is hard to move. It's in things like plants and stores and distribution networks. So, really understanding what's the best way for me to kind of move or adjust my capital to take advantage of the next S curve, and, sort of reskill my people. And, there are many folks that would tell us today 30% of all current jobs are either going to go away, they're going to change, or they're going to be completely new jobs as we think about working with machines and things. And so the leadership challenge is really, looking ahead for your industry, thinking about what do I need to do to make that pivot? Where is the S? And subsequently, I have to probably go through a dual transformation, which most enterprises are going down.
So have you been markedly adjusting your transformation strategies based on what happened last year differently than you had already set for the next, say, 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think Coca-Cola, this is all public. We definitely have an emerging stronger strategy, and much of that was shared recently by the organization at CAGNY, and we're operating completely different than before COVID. And just on a personal note, if I can, Beth Ann, because I think it's a good learning. So, I did start a medical spa about 3 years ago that I spend the weekends on. And, we're operating completely different today than we were before COVID. If you asked me as an entrepreneur of my own brand, how to drive UGC 5-star reviews, it's marketably different today than it was a year and a half ago. Form factor, value, in the service itself, and the way we see. I mean, it's really different. It's completely different. And if you ask me about live streaming, we're doing it. Now, we're not crushing it, but we just leaned in and did it. We didn't have to go through legal and maybe some other things like a big corporation. We just went ahead and did it. And so, our spa, we may have 7 people in the spa on a Friday at 2:00, but maybe we're broadcasting to 1,900. And probably, maybe 1 to 4% of those humans will come into the spa. So Beth Ann, this idea of being an entrepreneur, hands on the keyboard, being an entrepreneur has so much benefit to large scale enterprises that are trying to be more entrepreneurial. Now, I want to continue to berate that point, but I think it's really important.
Very important. Yeah, I've always loved the notion of entrepreneurialism as well, which is that idea that even in a big enterprise-wide company, you can still draw from and codify those entrepreneurial mindsets and behaviors and disciplines and ways of operating. So it sounds like you're doing that. What an incredible way to have like this side hustle. Sounds like, I think it's primarily for your wife, and so you get to bring your kind of marketing prowess and understanding from your real job into that, but also take a little bit of that energy and learning that you're getting and apply it to what you do day to day. So do you find yourself either, or maybe it's an and versus an either, do you find yourself drawing from some of those learnings and applying it immediately into work? And then are you also trying to inspire your colleagues to find a way to get kind of that side hustle on that they can learn from?
Absolutely goes both ways. And, I think the best way to learn about entrepreneurship is just jump in and do it. And, so many of my friends have side hustles where they're doing this. And some are, it's more for the learning maybe. And others it's for the learning. And like there's a real business, like there's, $10,000 in revenue a week being created. And so I definitely see, more of that, at least in sort of my network. And I think with Gen Z, and if you look at the career path of a Gen Z human over the next 30 years, they're going to be doing so much gig work. They're not going to be working, for the most part, I don't believe, for large corporations for 20 and 30 years. They're going to be doing much more agile gig work. It's going to be a completely different career track. They're probably going to change careers 5 or 6 times. This is what much of the research would tell you about Gen Z. What does that all add up to? I'm not exactly sure, but if you're able to be an entrepreneur, it's going to be better.
Yeah, agree. So talk to me a little bit about that sort of future generation. Obviously, it's critically important to the success of your business. What are the things that you're doing to, imbue them into the brands, into the products, to learn about them, to continue to push the way that you're communicating so it feels relevant? Are there insights that you're gaining along the way? And what are some of the, the tools or the tricks of the trade to really understand and know them?
just my own personal point of view, kind of being close to the topic, working with so many customers and wonderful partners, is transparency. This Gen Z, they're expecting transparency. And the way you build trust is not about talking about things, it's doing things. Kind of a big point, a little different than the prior generations. I also think that there's certainly, they value reviews, but not blindly. So, user-generated content continues to be important, but with some level of a filter there, but still very important. Community, the more you can connect your brand to the local community is so important. What is this brand doing to specifically help community? Really important. I also think purpose, we talked about earlier, is way at the top. It's, it's not just a slogan, it's what you live and do. And then as we talked about earlier, ESG, I just think that's really important. How is your brand good or bad for the planet, big picture? How is it driving value in my community? I really want to understand that. It really matters. And so it's, it's a little more complex, I think, today to build a brand story and live it for Gen Z. The standard is a little higher, if you will. And of course, everything is digital first for this group. It's amazing what you showed them, a cassette recorder, et cetera, et cetera. They've never seen that. So it's just kind of funny. I'm raising a couple of these Gen Z consumers now, so that does help as well.
You have your built-in focus group there at home. That is always helpful if you can go find those true Gen Zers in your life. But what's interesting, I think, I used to do a lot in the area of segmentation, that it's, less sometimes generational things that are the dividing line now. That is, we're not building segmentations necessarily just around age. We're building it around mindsets and, to your point, behaviors and these bigger themes of the planet, consumerism, more human factors that are what ultimately unites people. So I like what you're saying and what you're hitting upon there, because you're not necessarily alienating an audience that has loved you for years and been loyal to many of your brands and to your company, at the same time that you're continually bringing in a bigger, broader, newer audience. There's nothing that would kind of make you feel less relevant to me, because we share still a lot of those same mindsets. Is that something that you're specifically thinking about in your communications? Those kinds of connectivity around those those ideas and attributes and value systems versus just a generational age difference.
Totally. Mm-hmm. No, it is. There's no question about it. And though you have to do that, through a segmented lens around, affordability. And so I think these days when you talk about marketing and branding, you got to be using the term affordability, because there's just a segment of the population post-COVID that's more important than ever. It doesn't mean we necessarily have to drop the price point, but there's different ways and packages and form factors that can reach all consumers. And I think most brands, and certainly Coca-Cola, are very in tune with Gen Z and are, positioning brands that are attractive to them, and all the attributes we've been talking about clearly come into play on sort of that brand vision architecture that you have, for essentially the brand plan.
Well, this has been incredible. You are a superstar in our space for sure. I'm sure you're also one of the more popular guys in your company right now. As soon as things started to shift in commerce, people were probably gravitating towards you for the answers and helping think through the new strategies. I'm sure it's been a very demanding time as well.
Well, thank you, Beth Ann. We just want to be a great partner for our customers and partners in general, and enjoy WPP and what you guys do, because you're a key partner to bring value to our entire ecosystem, and always value the time with you guys.
I appreciate that. And I really have always appreciated that client agency bond and relationship when you are, connected in that way and you recognize that you're both better together, is something else that Raja talks about in quantum marketing. So I do appreciate that you withhold that as well. For those of you that are wanting more of Barry's time and thinking, you can follow him on LinkedIn at Barry Thomas. I know he would appreciate getting notes from you and continuing to get inspired and provoked. If you have other questions that have gone unanswered from here, he's someone who's great to follow, and he mentions he's an avid follower as well. So the two of us have many people in common that we look to for advice in this space and guidance, and things are changing so quickly. So it really does help to have other resources and expertise out there. And this afternoon, we've got a whole packed agenda on that too. So Lauren, thank you for kicking us off this morning or this afternoon, and Barry for being our first up, and over to you to keep us going.
Thanks, Beth Ann, and thanks, Barry. It's great to have another Atlantan on the stage.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you, Beth Ann. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, guys.